From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. Today we're going to be talking about Sudan, a country that is currently facing a wave of protests, now in their fourth week, and a deepening economic crisis, prompting calls for major reforms and a change in political leadership. To discuss the situation, I'm joined today by Nisrin Elamin and Rania Biraq. Nisrin is a doctoral candidate in anthropology at Stanford, whose research focuses on land use, social relations, and Gulf agricultural investment in central Sudan. Rania is an activist in Sudan who's been participating in the protests. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Rania, I'd like to start with you. What's going on in Sudan now, and where do things stand?
What's going on in Sudan right now, there is a protest everywhere, almost in most of the states in Sudan. Everyone is out there protesting.
Who specifically is participating in the protests?
This time is different. It's not like the times before. I mean, this time it's not parties who goes for the protest, but it's the people, the citizens.
It's more widespread and broad-based.
Yes, it's the protest been started in Damascene on 13th of December because of the President al-Bashir decision of increasing the bread prices from £1 to £3.
And how much of an effect does that have on the average person in Sudan?
Well, actually, there's no bread at all. There's bread queues everywhere. There is fuel queues everywhere. Even there is no cash at the banks or the ATMs. I mean, the maximum to withdraw is $10, which is nothing.
And how widespread are the protests at this point? Is there a difference between what's happening in Khartoum versus the rest of the country, or is it kind of across the board?
Actually, it's mostly all over Sudan right now. Most of the Sudanese citizens are going for a protest. They all want the fall of the regime right now because there is the simplest elements of life. It's not there.
Now that the protests are in their kind of fourth week, how have protesters' demands changed over time? You spoke about just now about asking for the resignation of the president. Has that have the protesters' demands evolved over the past month?
Well, actually, nothing changed yet. We just go on protesting, and people are getting killed and detained, but there is no changes. We don't see any changes.
How does the situation compare to previous rounds of protests in 2011 and 2012? What's different this time around?
Well, the difference now, it's as I said before, it's not the parties or the political parties. It used to be from the political parties before, but now it's the people itself. It's from the people. And everyone is having a rough life over here in Sudan. So as I said before, it's the people itself.
The president has recently said that change should come at the ballot box in the 2020 elections. Is that a viable answer at this point?
I don't think so. It's been 30 years now. We didn't see anything.
Switching over you to Nisrin, in the piece that you wrote in the Washington Post a couple of weeks back, you were critical of how the protests have been portrayed in the international media and said that really misrepresents the situation. Can you elaborate on that and explain what you see as kind of the broader context at play here?
Sure. I mean, I think for one, in the international media, there's been very little coverage of the protests in Sudan in comparison to, say, the Yellow Vest protests in France or other protests that have happened elsewhere, even though we're as you mentioned, in our fourth week. And in addition to that, to us, there was a very kind of narrow framing and misrepresentation of these protests as bread riots. Of course, they were triggered, as Rania said, by the rising bread prices, but immediately people were demanding peace, freedom, dignity, and regime change. They were not demanding, reduced bread prices. And so I think that's an important thing, that from the very beginning, people were asking for really a change to the current political system that has put this very brutal and repressive regime in power for over 30 years. And I think it also, what it does, that kind of framing of it being about an economic crisis or bread riots, feeds right into the Bashir regime's own kind of rhetoric around the fact that this is just simply an economic crisis that can be solved by reinstituting subsidies that, by the way, were actually recommended by the International Monetary Fund, and that this is, caused by external factors like sanctions, etc. When we all know that the cause of this crisis is political, and that it has very much to do with this regime and its inability to give up power, despite people's demands, not only during these protests, but really for a very long time now.
I wanted to ask about the economic side of things. I know one of the ways that the government has sought to compensate for the loss of oil revenue following the secession of South Sudan in 2011 is by bringing in new foreign investment, particularly in mining and agriculture. And I wanted to ask you about your work on the latter, given your research on land use and Gulf agricultural investment. What impact has that had in rural areas, and how does that fit into this whole kind of dynamic that's bubbling up?
There have been billions of dollars of investment coming from several Gulf Arab states into agriculture. And so what has happened is you have Saudi Arabian and Emirati companies, for example, that are leasing these large tracts of, millions of acres of agricultural land that people used and owned for generations. And so these investments were preceded by a process of land dispossession or land seizures by the state that were then given to these investors. And of course, that has produced a lot of anger. My research really focuses on the different political strategies that people in a part of Sudan called the Jazeera have been using to reclaim access and rights to the land that has been taken from them. And I think what's important to note here historically is that Sudan has a long history of resistance, popular uprisings against military regimes. We've unfortunately, since our independence, primarily been ruled by military regimes. In 1964 and in 1985, the Sudanese people rose up and overthrew their military governments. And these protests are sort of in that vein. But one of the things perhaps that this government did differently in 1989 when it came to power is it systematically dismantled trade unions and also the opposition. They tortured opposition members and detained them. And then they protest-proofed Khartoum. And so during these protests, what's unique is that they emerged, as Rania mentioned, in other parts of Sudan before they arrived in Khartoum. So you have all these smaller towns, including towns in the Jazeera where I work, mobilizing. And I think there was a bit of an underestimation by the regime of how powerful these mobilizations could be. So while there are no official trade unions, or they've been co-opted by the regime, even farmers' unions have been, in the parts of the Jazeera that I work in, people have been organizing and forming their own independent unions and mobilizing against the government in that way.
Is it safe to say then that the unions were kind of key to the previous revolts in 64 and 86?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. And I think we see, though, in these protests also movements that are, as Rania mentioned, not affiliated with the sort of mainstream political parties and are more kind of grassroots movements led by young people. The professional union has been very involved in these protests as well, but also one of the main towns that rose up during these protests was Atbara, which is a town that's known for its historically for its railroad worker union organizing. And that I'm sure played into the ways that Atbara rose up as well.
I wanted to ask about the broader regional context at work here. Given the timing and the slogans that are being used, how would you say that these protests are informed by the kind of successes and failures of the Arab Spring uprisings?
I mean, I'd love to also hear Rania's perspective on this. I mean, for me, I think people forget that there were protests in Sudan before the ones in Egypt happened. And so while I think there are many parallels in terms of what people are protesting about, the fact that they want not, regime change and really a radical change to a political system that has been repressive and racist and that continues to marginalize and attack its own civilians. I think there's also a way in which the media has sort of in my opinion, in a somewhat racist way, said that, Sudan is kind of late to join the Arab Spring. I mean, Sudanese people have been protesting. We've been protesting for a long time. It's just that the response to it has been extremely repressive. Many people, including in these protests, over 42 people have died. I don't know what the unofficial numbers are, but I've heard that close to 2,000 people have been arrested.
Rania, do you want to comment on this as well?
Well, actually, I think Sudan has been protesting for decades now.
And you see this as being part of the kind of continuity of the same protests?
Yes, Sudanese people have been protesting for decades now, and all what they want is the fall of the regime, as what Nisrin said.
As an activist, what sort of changes beyond just the removal of the regime would you like to see to the political system in Sudan?
What we want is a constitution or a law. We don't want racism. We don't have education, and we need that now, and health and the simplest life elements. It's what we're missing, and there is more. We don't want the political parties to be involved.
What exactly do you mean by that? Can you explain a little bit more?
Yes. I mean, the political parties, when they get involved, things get more complicated. We just want a law that can be beside the people or the citizens. As here, we don't have any laws or all the laws. What we want here, or what the Sudanese people really want, is a good law that can protect them, to be by their sides, as we don't have that anymore.
I wanted to ask about the role of the military and the security services. Have they, what their kind of stance is on the protests? Is there any chance that they could get involved and kind of throw their weight behind things, or where does that stand?
No, I don't think so, because the military forces, they're all against the protesters. They've been shooting and throwing tear gas into houses, hospitals, and schools during the demonstrations. I don't think the military army will be by our side anytime.
You mentioned shootings and stuff. Do you have any sense of what the number of people that have been injured, the number of people that have been killed, the number of people that have been imprisoned in the protests so far?
The number of demonstrators killed during the demonstration in several cities is nearly 45. The number of the detainees by al-Bashir militaries between 13 December and 14 January, approximately 441.
So quite sizable numbers for sure.
Yes.
What are, in your mind, kind of likely scenarios going forward? How do you see this situation playing out? We're in the fourth week now. What's changed since it started? Where does it go from here?
Well, actually, we do have hope that this regime will fall. And we will keep protesting till we make it fall. What we see is that the government right now, or the regime, is they're afraid. And that's why they've been talking on the media, and they've been threatening the protesters.
Nisrin, I'd like to get your thoughts on this as well. Where do you see things going from here? What are the kind of likely scenarios?
It's hard to say, but I think we're definitely way past the point of turn. If in terms of, I think this regime will fall. I think that there's, and people will continue to, as Rania mentioned, protest until it does. I was just talking to my father yesterday, who is 81 years old, and he joined the protests as well, having seen several of these in his lifetime. And, and he said, people have reached a breaking point where there is no way that this regime can stay in power. I don't know. I mean, hopefully the scenarios that we imagine would include a peaceful transition, right? To, as Rania mentioned, a process of democratic elections. But, clearly Bashir he seems to be holding on. And in the past, the military has played a pivotal role in sort of shifting things. And it seems this regime has been very strategic in the way that it's positioned the security forces in particular as very loyal to the Bashir regime. I mean, 70% of Sudan's budget or even more goes into the military and into the wars that have been killing people in Sudan. So it's a police state, essentially. And one of the things I do want to mention, though, is the role that the international community has played. And there are two things I want to mention. One is that the European Union has been funding the Bashir regime to the tune of $250 million to militarize its border with Egypt and Libya to stem migration from East Africa into Europe. And that has played into this as well. They've been receiving funding that sort of has buttressed this military state, if you will. And the other is the role that the United States is playing. They've been quite silent on this issue, and yet there's been a kind of thawing of the relationship between the Bashir regime and the United States after the ICC indictments that began during the Obama administration and continued during the Trump administration. And if you notice, Sudan was removed from the travel ban list. A particular number of sanctions were removed in late 2017. And part of what happened there is that the Sudanese government was sending troops, I think close to 10,000 troops, to fight the war in Yemen on the Saudi and UAE side.
Part of the coalition.
Exactly. As part of that coalition, they sent basically soldiers to that war, providing the kind of boots on the ground that the Saudis and Emiratis didn't want to risk themselves. And in return for that, the Emiratis lobbied on Sudan's behalf in Washington to get them removed from the travel ban list. That's part of the reason I think Bashir is able to stay in power, is that the international community has been playing a negative role in maintaining him, in sort of allowing him to stay there. And I think that's one thing that needs to change. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, the IMF recommended that Sudan implement these austerity measures. There have been austerity measures for a long time, even previous to these recent ones. But, part of that came because Sudan wanted to position itself to regain loans from these multilateral agencies. So there is, that's something that we need to remember. The international media has been very silent on this, and yet they have been playing, the international community has been playing a negative role in propping up al-Bashir.
Rania, I wanted to get your take on that. What, if anything, do you think the international community should be doing, and what would you like to see the international media doing as well?
I would like to see the international community not to support al-Bashir anymore. Because by supporting al-Bashir, that means more people dying here. I mean, there's wars in Sudan, and the army forces, they go to Yemen, and they fight there, as Nisrin said. And about the media, we don't see any media there. The media, they don't talk about what's happening here in Sudan.
Yes, coverage does seem to be quite limited on this story, for sure. I think we should probably wrap things up, but do you have any final thoughts, Rania?
What I think will happen next, we will keep protesting. We will try our best to make this corrupted regime to fall. We are just waiting for this moment so we can see what we can do next after that. We just want a constitution and a good law. We'll hope for the protest to continue till we make it.
That'll have to be the last word, but this is certainly a situation we'll be watching closely going forward. Nisrin, Rania, thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to my colleague Scott for producing today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.